Hi everyone, how are you doing today? Well, I have just finished a novel that I started a year ago in December, so right about the same time leading up to Christmas. And I had really been drawn into the novel at the time. I read about a third of it very quickly, and then I put it aside because I was finding it a bit depressing. Um, that book is Look at Me by Anita Brookner, and yes, I did finally finish it. Kind of an interesting story about how I even stumbled across this. I was just looking at free ebooks on my library's catalog, and obviously the cover is very striking. The title is, intriguing. And you could say that I judged the book by its cover, but, I didn't go into it with particularly high expectations. I'd never heard of Anita Brookner before. She was as it turns out, she was quite a prestigious British author, largely in the 1980s to, I believe, the early mid-2000s, I think. She was born in 1928. She was the daughter of Polish immigrants, and for most of her career, she was an art historian, of all things. I mean, she didn't get into writing until, later in life. She didn't publish her first novel until she was in her 50s. And yet she went on to be a very prolific novelist, and she actually won the Booker Prize in 1984. So, kind of a fascinating find. I mean, again, totally random, but I was, very impressed with this book, and I actually decided to do kind of a deep dive into this book and explain why it resonated so much with me. I'd like to start by reading a quote from the novel, which I think kind of sums up the timbre of the novel. And if this quote doesn't really ring any bells for you or resonate, then you'll kind of know maybe this isn't your cup of tea. But the narrator writes, "I like regularity of behavior and courtesy of manner and due attention paid to the existence of other people. I like an ordered life and discretion and reliability, and honesty, and a sense of honor. But I am aware that all these things have little currency where matters of love and friendship are concerned, and that an attractive shamelessness is a good passport to social success." So in a nutshell, Look at Me is about this young woman who works at a library, helping researchers find information, and she has a very tedious life, very routine. Sees the same people every day, whether they're coworkers or library visitors, has a lot of social obligations in terms of her small group of I believe they're either relatives or family friends, but they're all kind of older people. She doesn't really hang out with people her age a lot, and just kind of generally in a slump. But it's kind of been like that her whole life is kind of the implication here. And she's also going through tremendous grief over the loss of her mother, which isn't so much center stage in the book as always in the background. And I think that's one thing Brookner did so well. Just a very nuanced description of grief, very written in a way that you can understand the narrator's grieving style, and it's not profuse, it's just more subtle and lingering and aching. And so that's the person we're introduced to here. So again, I found this to be quite a bleak read a year ago, and I only picked it up recently because I was not in the best of moods, and I thought, I think I can shoulder through this because I'm at a point where I can probably handle it. But yeah, that's the narrator. This is her life, and her name is Frances, by the way. But again, she's such a background kind of a person, and you kind of tend to forget her name even. And one interesting thing that happens is, she finally makes these two friends named Alex and Nick. And I believe Nick is one of the regulars at the library, and Alex is his wife. And they are absolutely the opposites of her. They are social, they are rambunctious, flirty, glamorous. They're always doing things and seeing people and just having a grand old time. And they kind of, Alex in particular, kind of takes Frances under her wing and entices her with this idea that, hey, her life could be quite enjoyable and fun if she just befriends this couple and hangs out with them a lot. So kind of a interesting setup. But as the plot goes on, we realize there's quite a bit of a darker side to this relationship than it first appears, and that things are not as seamless as they appear in terms of the socializing and the new excitement that the narrator finds herself in. And it further is complicated when another doctor who's doing research at the library, his name is James. Our narrator, Frances, falls in love with him, or more correctly, I would say she becomes attached to him. And so this group of 3 friends becomes a group of 4 friends, and things get a lot messier from there. It's very sad, and I will say not a ton happens, but it is written so well because it's a portrait of what goes on in the narrator's head. And I would say probably 60% of the book is just her overthinking, picturing scenarios play out in various ways, trying to analyze her feelings about things and other people's feelings about things, but never quite hitting the mark. And I'll get back to that later. But right off the bat, I was so very reminded of Charlotte Bronte, and really Jane Eyre, of course, being the more famous of Bronte's works. But actually, I think that Look at Me shares a lot more in common with Villette, because both of these female characters have a lot of trauma that they are trying to recover from, but they don't, or I should say, they aren't really, they don't have what they need to recover from it. And it's just a constant phantom in their life that they are always running into, and they're just desperate for companionship, but they're also very steely and very, in a way at times caustic. Like they're very, they've built up these defenses around them and have found ways of coping in just exquisite perfection, but there's these little, holes in their armor that you see as the book goes on. All right, my camera thought it would be cute to shut off for a bit, so let's try that again. Hopefully I was able to tell you about the comparisons between Villette and Look at Me. Really though, in the main character and how she clings to other people, maybe not externally, but internally. And it's quite sad, really quite sad. But also a good lesson to be learned. And we can talk more about that later in the video. A couple of things I wanted to highlight in this book, just briefly. Like, one thing I liked about Brookner's writing style is that she isn't content to merely tell a story and take you from scene A to scene B and so on. This isn't, it's so much more than that kind of writing. She is very, subtle but intentional about the world that she's building that you see through the narrator's eyes. For example, there's this kind of contrast between the old world and the new. So like the routines and the decor and the apartment that her parents had lived in, and various characters at the library kind of representing the old world. Again, sort of fading into the distance now that we're in the 80s, moving towards the end of the century. And then again, the new world, which is, really, I think, personified in Nick and Alex, who are very materialistic, and they kind of live the high life. I was also reminded of The Great Gatsby, frankly, which, again, there's like a lot of similarities between this book and Gatsby in the sense that it follows these characters who are just very careless, I think is the word Nick used. Nick Carraway, the narrator of The Great Gatsby. And, So I can kind of see some similarities there, but Frances of Look at Me, she will never be a Nick Carraway because Nick is able to separate himself from what he sees sufficiently to be able to moralize about it, and to he does get attached to Gatsby obviously, but he's always kind of a little bit distant and moralizing, and she does moralize, but she's also so attached to these characters, these people she meets, that she can never be as fully detached as Nick. I mean, sufficiently detached, I should say. And so that really does her a great disservice as the book goes on. I want to read some quotes that kind of summarize that, but I want to continue talking about the setting. The routine and the dreariness of the narrator's life is solidified by just kind of the same places showing up in the story almost iteratively. The library where she works, her lonely flat where it's just her and her housekeeper, and then kind of juxtaposed with a few glimpses of Nick and Alex's life. Alex always sitting in front of the mirror doing her hair, and the restaurant where they have very raucous dinners with Alex and Nick's friend Maria. So, again, very different settings, but also very repetitive, so you can kind of get into her mindset. It's very claustrophobic, and I really thought that was very well portrayed. If you've ever been in a time of life, or maybe you're in a time of life now where you're just struggling to break out of the routine, right? Or, actually do new things, or, kind of challenge yourself to get out of your comfort zone. That kind of, again, claustrophobia is well portrayed here. Okay, so I think I've kind of beaten you over the head with the idea that, this narrator is very isolated, and she is really struggling, because she wants to be part of this vivid crowd that she sees or perceives really in the couple of Nick and Alex, but is kind of trapped in her own personality and circumstances. I wouldn't say that she's not really a Jane Eyre in the sense that she's, highly religious, or what's the word I would use? Jane Eyre has a very strong set of principles that come from her religious beliefs. And I think when it comes to the narrator of Look at Me, I don't think that what holds her back is a moral compass per se. I think it has a lot more to do with what she has been raised to perceive as the proper sequence of events and how relationships should proceed. Again, not necessarily because of moral reasons, because she obviously envies the lifestyle of Nick and Alex, that is. And just based on her actions, you can kind of tell that what holds her back is more about expectations, I think. That's how I would frame that. I don't know. That was just my take on it. So let's talk a little bit about the characters. I've already talked about the narrator at length, but I want to talk about Alex for a minute. She is the wife of this researcher, Nick, and the narrator compares her to She Who Must Be Obeyed, who is the goddess character from Rider Haggard's novel She, which is a very influential novel from, oh boy, what year is this? 1887. This was a very influential book upon authors such as Tolkien, and is referenced here as well. But yeah, this idea of a very powerful female character, I liked this angle because I noticed that the book is very matriarchal. You would think, oh, it's set in the 80s, isn't it going to be more patriarchal? Not so much. I think that a lot of the characters in this book who the narrator perceives as having power are female. So again, most obviously that would be the glamorous and beautiful and flirty and vivacious Alex. But there's also her housekeeper who always follows the same routines, always treats the narrator as a child. There's other female characters such as this elderly lady at the library who's very, she's very outgoing, and honestly, I just think that there is a strong sense of female power in this book, but it's not coming from the narrator, and she's like overly aware of that. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Let's talk for a minute about the male characters in this book, specifically the guy she's dating, whose name is James. A few things really struck me about James. One was that when she first met him, she had a bad impression of him. And then, secondly, as the novel progressed, James barely has a voice. When he finally does say something of great importance, which I'm not going to say what it is, obviously, spoilers, but it just came as a bit of a shock to me, actually. And I think that might be intentional. What I saw in this book was that the narrator was constantly being the voice of James, and I don't mean like literally, but always thinking about what he might be thinking and what she thought he was going to do. Just kind of rarely even showing us the conversations that they had together, maybe even never, honestly. Like, it was kind of a weird characterization, but it made so much sense to me in the context of the narrator's struggles with overthinking and anxiety and, again, the grief. Like, it was just very beautifully written in that sense. Like, it can't be a coincidence that James barely said anything to her in this novel, and I think that it's one of those signs of a really good writer when they are very intentional like that about how different characters are allowed to speak, or through what eyes and ears we are allowed to perceive them. But ultimately, she just is attracted to James mostly because he seems to be interested in her, and she enjoys this kind of, honestly, I would describe it as a fatherly relationship to him, or him to her. And she sort of takes different character traits she sees in them and frames them in really positive ways that she wants, I guess. For example, he's quite a severe and stiff character when she first meets him, so she kind of mistakes that for him being very, above board and honorable. I just thought that was so fascinating. On the earlier topic of gender, I feel like the narrator is also kind of, I won't say the word competing necessarily, but there is some kind of mental gymnastics that she's doing that really, I think, juxtapose the narrator more with James than with Alex. You could even say that Frances as a narrator is archetypically masculine because she's very analytical. She's always, trying to evaluate the situation and make decisions that are logical to her. Again, I'm speaking archetypically here. It's not something I subscribe to, but, it's just kind of an interesting setup where that's part of how she relates to James. So I think she relates to James more on that intellectual level, quite frankly. Even though there is a physical attraction to him, I think it still comes back to this mental and emotional, really, bond that she feels like she's forming with him. Whereas with characters like Alex, I think our narrator she kind of defaults to the child archetype, and really, whenever she's around these women of power, like I mentioned earlier, she's always she ends up feeling like a child. And I think that's significant too, because in terms of, if we were using therapy speak here, I think it's clear that the inner child of Frances, so that part of her that is very much run by the emotions she experienced as a child and her coping mechanisms and the things that she perceived and expected as a child, are still with her and kind of running her life. And that seems to me appropriate based on the fact that, she feels childish around other people. And I don't think that's just a coincidence. I don't think that's just her personality. I think it points to this thing that's remnant from her childhood that has so much power over her mind that she's having a hard time putting that aside. And letting the adult Frances run the show. Okay, so I think the other book that I wanted to compare this with before I forget was The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton, which I read a couple of years ago. I think that this book is a little more satisfactory than The House of Mirth because I did not like how The House of Mirth ended. I'm not going to tell you how this book ends because I don't want to spoil it, but I think it was a realistic and fitting ending, and yet partly greatly unsatisfactory, I would say. But both The House of Mirth and Look at Me feature heroines that are pushed to sort of this moment of desperation. I do want to talk about that moment in this book, and I wouldn't say it's a spoiler. I'm going to talk about it, but just a heads up, I wouldn't say it's a spoiler, but it's really the scene where she's walking through the city at night towards the end of the book, and she encounters a tunnel and then one or two underpasses. I believe it's a total of 2 underpasses, but essentially when she first goes on this walk, she just feels like the adrenaline from her emotions, and she feels like she can face anything, and it's kind of a recklessness though. Like, she doesn't care if she runs into trouble as she's walking through the park at night or through the tunnel or under the underpass. When she finally reaches the last underpass is when her fear returns to her. But I think that the tunnel and the underpasses are kind of metaphors for how she has approached these characters in this book. Again, that recklessness and that willingness to allow herself to be harmed, because in case you haven't figured it out by now, but Nick and Alex are not very nice people, to say the least, and I don't believe they ever treat her with respect. You might wonder, like, why is she allowing herself to be treated that way? But again, because Brookner is such a talented writer, you really can get into Frances's psyche and understand that she is that lonely that she doesn't mind being trampled on. And to some extent, that could also be traced back to, behaviors she's tolerated from her past. In fact, she does kind of allude to that. So, although not necessarily connecting those dots, I just think it's just a really brilliant portrait of what happens to someone when they are weighed down by isolation, when they are not through grieving somebody, and yet their life has to go on and they have to, go back to work and so on and so forth. Yeah, I just, like I said, some of this really hit home and I was very deeply impressed by it. So what I want to do at the end of this video is read you a few quotes I really liked, and then at the end I'm going to give you some of my thoughts about what you can take from this book, or what I took from it, and hopefully that'll help somebody out there. Alex was the only sort of woman whom Nick's sort of man would have chosen, and we were left with the distinct impression that there was only one example in each category: Nick and Alex. I had tried so hard to live sensibly and without undue expectation, for my expectations, alas, have often led me to make mistakes, and now that something so encompassing and vivifying had turned up, I found it difficult to believe in my luck. Good things could only follow. I needed to know that not everyone carries a wound, and that this wound bleeds intermittently through life. I needed to be taught that life can put on a good turn of speed and bowl one along with it. I needed to learn from experts that pure egotism that had always escaped me, for the little I had managed to build up, and which had so far only gone into my writing, was quickly vanquished by the sight of that tremulousness, that lost look in the eye, that disappointment that seemed to haunt me, to get in my way, even to obtrude on my consciousness, when I was busy building up my resources of selfishness. That's another interesting thing about this book. Again, she's not coming from the same mindset as, let's just say, Jane Eyre or whatever. Like, she really does seem to think that her problem has just always been being too timid and meek and not being selfish enough. And to some extent that could be true, especially if you're always letting yourself be walked over, as she often is. But ultimately, I don't think that anyone finds happiness from selfishness in its fullest form, as I would say Nick and Alex exhibit it. It kind of is saddening to me that the narrator feels like she has only two choices: to live as recklessly as they do and, go around treating people the way they do, or her other thought is maybe she should just be a writer and, be the quiet, observant, witty, sly person that puts all these people in a book and kind of games the system in that sense. I mean, not really even gaming the system, but just profiting off of what she sees. It's really quite sad. She doesn't seem to have something greater than herself to measure herself by or to be striving towards. And it's I think it kind of just re-solidifies to me the necessity of that, But yeah, that's some of the sad and cynical feelings that she has throughout the book. There were some really good quotes from like the last part the book. I'm not going to give spoilers, of course. Above all, the thought of reverting to the role of observer rather than participant filled me with dread and sadness. I, who found it so difficult to shed my beady isolation, must in fact never appear to be lonely. I must be the odd one at every gathering, and in order to hide my sense of shame, I must pretend to be taking notes. Where I had once thought to say, "Look at me," I must now turn the attention of others away from myself. I might try to post some of these on my blog, but generally, yeah, there were some really good quotes here. Very profoundly insightful on the psychology of those who find themselves in the narrator's shoes. So just wanted to wrap it up here with a few thoughts on kind of the overarching theme of this book and how those of us who have ever found ourselves in these kinds of situations might avoid them. First of all, it's tricky because you want to make sure you don't have the wrong friends. Like, that's really important, and obviously the wrong friends here made life worse for Frances. So that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind. It's never worth it being around someone who treats you poorly, doesn't, care about you really, just kind of uses you and moves along. So you want to avoid making friends and acquaintances like that. But at the same time, isolation is really harmful. So, making some effort to try to connect with others, even if it's, online, really, like, whatever you can do to find that connection, it is worth looking for. It really is. Also, going to new places and breaking your routines. If you're a very routine-oriented person, I know I am, it can be quite an effort just to go to a new place, try a new restaurant, go to a different library or a bookstore. Things that may be easy for other people, but, difficult for some of us. Important to break your routine if the routine is hurting you. On the other hand, if you're someone with very few routines or just find yourself kind of drifting from day to day, I think routines can be incredibly helpful. So, wherever you find yourself on that spectrum, make sure you're kind of balanced there. Yeah, try something different. One thing that I disliked about our narrator here, and yet we can all find ourselves doing, is, just doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. It's the famous quote, that's how you get insanity. And really, it's true. Like, you need to try a different approach or meet new people if what continuously happens, if you see a pattern of people mistreating you, or if you see a pattern of, bad experiences, well, repeating what you did isn't going to help in most cases. So, trying new things. And then I think the last thing I would really recommend to anyone is practice resilience before you need it. If you are in a place where, you're kind of on a level or things are pretty stable, I mean, it's really important to practice resilience before the time that you'll actually need it. And what I mean by that is if you can possibly try to prepare yourself mentally and emotionally for tougher times ahead and just be aware that they will likely happen in some form, then when you get to those times, it'll be a lot more manageable. In my case, I've taken a lot of effort to try not to be isolated. I've also tried to make sure I am okay being independent as much as possible. And I don't mean in like a very highly coping way, but truly trying to do something that I really enjoy and feel productive in and feel some kind of community in. And, I guess that's a nice segue. Like, that's kind of what YouTube is for me, in large part. And so, yeah, that's one of the reasons I do it, honestly. And that's a nice little segue just to say that I appreciate the recent milestone of 2,000 subscribers. It's not a huge number in YouTube terms, but I am grateful and happy and excited to have reached it. And given that I haven't really even been trying to grow the channel properly, like it's so exciting, and I'm really grateful to everyone who subscribed, whether it was recently or years ago. Thanks for being part of my community. Yeah, I guess that's all I really had to say about this book. Kind of went a long time on this, but would recommend it. Just be aware of the depressing subject matter, but it's a good novel and I think underrated. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.